Hi, I'm Christy, Associate Editor here at Bookstr. Today, we're lucky enough to be live with Patricia Walsh Chadwick, author of Little Sister, a Memoir. Thank you so much for being here today.
Thank you for having me.
Little Sister is guaranteed to be one of the most unique and compelling memoirs coming out this year, with a depiction of a childhood within an unusual religious sect. There are many draconian rules imposed, things that people might find a little bit peculiar. But at the same time, it's a very inspiring story about a family that can really survive anything. So you say in your memoir that you initially had a challenging time sharing this story with others, that initially there were only two people that you could really tell. So how did you kind of adjust to being able to share this story with the world?
Well, I was really in my mid-50s when I decided, okay, 50 years from now, there won't be anybody left who was even associated with this. And fortunately, both of my parents were alive at the time.
Yeah.
And we were sitting together, and it was my 55th birthday. And I said to my parents, I actually look back with great pleasure on my childhood. And I know that may seem a little surprising. And I said, I want to write the stories because pretty soon nobody will be an eyewitness. And I thought an eyewitness version would be better than hearsay.
Of course.
Then they were so supportive. And 5 years later is when I actually started. So I was actually 60 years old when I started to put paper and pencil together. And that took me 10 years.
Wow.
Because I had to learn the craft of writing.
Of course.
I've been a writer of business material, but not a storyteller.
Absolutely.
And so I went to memoir writing classes. I did that for 4 or 5 years. And then let the story unfold. It wasn't always easy to write, not so much from an emotional standpoint, but from trying to develop the right arc of the story.
Absolutely.
And so here I am at age 70. My mother read the entire book.
Oh, that's so
It
wonderful.
had her support. She said some of it made her sad, but she said, in fact, it's all true and you need to publish it. So it was wonderful to have her blessing. Fortunately, my father, who was quite a bit older than my mother, died at the age of 90 before I actually started writing it. But for me, it was really a fulfillment of something that I felt my parents were very supportive of. Absolutely.
Well, we're all very glad that you did publish the book, and you definitely have the technical elements of writing down. Wonderfully, your parents were supportive, but one thing that I think our audience is probably wondering is, how did other members of the community feel when this book was in the publication process, and then also when it actually hit shelves?
Yes, so remember that this community was about 100 people in total.
Yes.
39 children and let's call it 60-odd adults. Of course, those adults, I'm now 70, so those adults are a generation above me, and most of them have now passed away.
Right.
And the fact of the matter is, I was fully aware that many would be unhappy because this was their life. They dedicated their life to living the way they did. And I, who had left that life, was now writing about it, and I did not want to hurt any of them. They were my family as well. And I really was very pleased to be writing it after most of them had in fact passed away. There are a few that are still left, and there are those who are almost second generation in terms of having joined the group, which is now very legitimized with the Catholic Church. And they are not happy, the adults. With regard to the children, so I'm calling myself a child in that regard, at 70.
A little sister.
A little sister and a little brother. Those that have read it, and maybe I would say 10 or so have read it, and unfortunately some of the 39 of us have died. Of those who have read it, every single one has been so supportive. People who did not expect to be happy about it have said, thank you for writing it. I read it in a day and a half. I thought I was going to hate it. I thought I was going to be terribly emotional. Some were emotional. But that to me has been so gratifying because in a way it has actually brought some people who were so troubled by their upbringing, it has brought them to a point where they're willing to re-engage with people who were part of their childhood. For me, that in and of itself makes the book worth having written.
Of course. I think it's wonderful that you've been able to have such support from the people that you grew up with, people who shared this same unique experience.
Exactly.
But many people have viewed this experience in different lights. So you refer to it as a community, some people refer to it as a sect, but other people refer to it as a cult. And you say yourself in the memoir that you became aware that the outside world perceived your community and the way that you'd grown up as a cult. So how did you feel about that term as a child, and how do you feel about it now?
As a child, we saw ourselves against the world. Mm-hmm. And as a young adult, I came to realize that the outside world, because Time magazine had written an article about it in 1965, and I thought, oh my gosh. I wrote my entire book without ever using the word cult. Cult to me, and I remembered very well in the 70s, was something like Jonestown.
Yeah.
I didn't associate my upbringing with anything like Jonestown. Mm-hmm. That being said, I remember Waco, Texas, and the Branch Davidians, which I think was in the 1990s when Janet Reno was, overseeing the situation. And I remember very clearly feeling one with those people behind that barricade, which does say that that us against the world kind of mentality, which is very often what a cult is all about, was very, very much a part of who I was. But it was my daughter, who's now 25, so she was about 20 at the time. She was in college, and she came home one weekend, and she said, "Mom, I have to tell you two things. First, you need to stop everything and finish writing this book."
We're very glad you did.
Which was really lovely, because some children will go, "Mom, you had the weirdest upbringing, and I don't really want to have any of my friends know." This gal was out there and sharing it. And the second thing she said, "Mom, you have to accept the fact that you grew up in a cult." And that took my breath away, because if you read the book, you will see the word cult, cultish came up. The word cult is not there. And I thought, wow, this is an honest child of mine. I love her, she loves me. She's not trying to hurt me. She's trying to open up my own mind. And at that point, I realized I wasn't going to change the book. It was now kind of in the publishing process. But I realized, not out of the mouth of babes, because she was 20 years old, but she was actually telling me the truth, and I accepted it.
Yeah. How difficult was it for you to kind of adjust to maybe a new conception, or a more, I guess, understanding conception of what had happened to you?
The fact of the matter is, when I really thought about what cults are all about and how they're led, I had not done a lot of analysis, perhaps deliberately not wanting subliminally to find out that there were serious correlations. But when you read about them, and the first thing they do is they separate families.
Yes.
Don't allow you to contact the outside world. Break down that bond of family.
Yeah.
Those are telltale signs. And so I accept all of that. But truly, the story for me is, this is not a mommy dearest story. And I say this over and over again. This is truly a story, a love story. It's a story about a family that could not be broken. And the very fact that my father in particular broke the rules of the community, and we were not allowed to speak to our parents, they were not allowed to speak to us. We had a few moments, 45 minutes every few months, when we could engage with them. But in the meantime, when my father would pass me or my sisters, I had 3 sisters and a brother, I was the oldest of 5, he would do things like this. Just that little wiggling of his finger said to me, "I love you." And for me, that was the glue that held me together till the time I was allowed to speak to him.
Of course. No, the empathy you show towards your parents' situation and kind of everyone's role in this community is really incredible. But one thing that I think probably stood out to most readers is the way that you portray Catherine, right? So it's so clear that you have this deep, deep love of your family, but she is such a striking figure. Do you feel that she felt what she was doing was right, or that it was a power grab?
I've often thought about what drove her to do this. And today, were she alive, and there was a period of time when certainly I expressed and felt anger toward her. Today, I don't. I would like to say to her, did something horrific happen to you in your own childhood that made you feel that this was the only way to God? It was so counter-Catholic. It was so counter-Christian. So I will always be puzzled by that. And I will always also be puzzled by how she was able to control people who were not followers necessarily, highly intelligent, highly intellectual, highly educated.
Yeah.
And yet, as we moved from Cambridge out to Harvard, Massachusetts, and the rules became stricter and stricter, and the restrictions greater and greater, they followed. They said yes. But for me, I always felt that my parents and I were in this together.
Yes.
That it wasn't as though my parents had abandoned me. I felt that they were doing something that they didn't want to do. Now, as a child, I didn't realize that they could have said no. And that's their story, and they are not here anymore, so they will not necessarily tell it. They will never tell it. But the fact of the matter is, I have dedicated this book to my parents.
Of course.
And I think that is very important for me, so that the reader opening the book may then get in 50 pages and say, what in God's earth is going on here, and how could parents have done this kind of a thing? But I want them to remember, at the beginning, it's dedicated to them. And if people choose not to read to the end of the book, they can come away with a very negative feeling towards my parents. But if they read it all the way to the end, there is very much a full circle coming together, and it makes more sense.
Yes. Well, Catherine was obviously such a powerful, manipulative figure, you know, kind of balancing the nurturing aspects of promising you pets and all of these freedoms, and then at the same time imposing all these rules of silence, changing your name to Anastasia. It's very, very striking to readers, and I think it certainly gets across the powerful love you feel towards your parents and the way that this individual impacted those familial bonds.
But interestingly, she was the only figure within the entire community that could dispense love. So for me, as a child, I wanted to be loved by her.
Of course.
And I felt as though I fell short every single step of the way. And she was my godmother. And godfathers had a particularly special relationship with their godchildren. So 39 children and 60-odd adults. And Sister Catherine herself was the godparent to a number of the children, but just a few. And all the others would have their special relationships. And for me, I thought, what have I done wrong? She loves the other children that she's godmother to. And what have I done wrong? Why can I not get her love?
But one thing that's also so striking in the memoir is that it really doesn't read as a mommy dearest, right? It's really not a bitter story at all. It's so optimistic, so much resilience in it. And one thing that I think our audience has to know is, how did you kind of reconcile what happened to you while also maintaining a Catholic faith? How did you separate those two things from each other?
Well, I think I'm blessed in many ways. I'm a glass half full kind of girl. I've often said I could be buried up to my neck and I'll find a way of getting out. And I've had an array of situations, not the least of which is a story in the book when I was thumbing, hitchhiking, which was I knew I shouldn't have done it, and got myself into a terrible peck of trouble, but took the situation into my own hands and managed to extricate myself from it. So just repeat the specific you want me to answer on the with regard to
how you were able to kind of separate Catholicism as a religion from kind of the particularities of this community.
We considered ourselves more Catholic than the Pope. And when Vatican II came out, which for many listeners here, they might not remember, this was way back in the early 1960s. Yes. We, as a Catholic, but excommunicated at that time, a Catholic organization, basically thought that Vatican II was in itself heresy. That opening up the Mass in the vernacular, being in whatever language of the local parish, facing the altar to the people, allowing the people to be more participant in the Mass, was a violation of the Catholic ritual, the Catholic standard. And so that's what I believed and knew. Once I left, I realized that there were the most wonderful Catholics that the center excoriated. My own uncle and aunt, my father's sister and her husband and their 4 children, raised extremely Catholic. But we called them PFs, which stood for pious frauds.
Yeah.
And we treated all Catholics that were not part of our community as people that were not even likely to be saved.
Yeah.
Because if they thought that Jews could go to heaven, and they thought that Muslims could go to heaven, and Baptists and Anglicans and anybody could go to heaven, then they weren't true Catholics. And for me, when I first left, my Catholicism was hugely important to me. Over the subsequent 50 plus years, I have come to realize that Catholicism is so much broader and better and more wonderful than that. And I have found this Pope to be amazingly emblematic of Catholicism in its truest sense. And I have considered myself Catholic. I have never converted to any other religion, though there are those who would say that I am not a good Catholic. To me, a good Catholic is living my life in a way that I think Christ taught us. And so those are the things I focus on. And the rules that men make, and I will say men, because the Curia and the Vatican are comprised almost entirely of men, the rules that they make for people are so similar to the kind of draconian rules that many religions apply. That to me, and that to many, many people, and that to this Pope, is not what Catholicism is all about. So I am very proud of saying I am a Catholic.
Of course. Now, before we open up the floor to audience questions, there's one more thing that we're all dying to address, which is the fact that you were actually kicked out of this community.
Yes.
You were kicked out for expressing innocent childhood crushes, the kind of thing that anybody would experience. And that completely altered the trajectory of your life. So how difficult was it adjusting to life afterwards? Did you kind of have internalized struggles with seeing yourself as, worldly, which was one of the worst things that you could be? I know that there were some beliefs that were taught in this community that may be discriminatory that you had to unlearn. What was that process like for you?
The most amazing part of leaving was the fact that I entered the world having never seen a television show, never eaten in a restaurant, never reading a newspaper.
Almost impossible to imagine.
Never seeing a magazine, not knowing the names of baseball players, tennis players, actors, actresses, and not knowing the language of the world. Not one swear word had ever entered the arena that we were, not even a slang word.
Wow.
So I walked out, and it was a world that was completely foreign. It was as though I was an alien. And so I remained very silent. I listened, I observed, and I self-taught for a substantial amount of time.
Well, you were always a quick study.
Well, I did on the other hand, I had been always, all my life as a child, I thought, but I want to be out in that world.
Yes.
And we had the stories of the saints. We had very few secular stories. But Heidi, even just reading the book Heidi.
Yes.
I just wanted to go and see the Alps. Any saint stories, it didn't matter where they came from. The cedars of Lebanon were something I wanted to see. I wanted to go to the Mediterranean Sea.
Yeah.
So I had this kind of get up and go, this wanderlust that was created by the stories that were fed to me, but which wasn't able to be fulfilled. So the moment I stepped out into that real world, I truly started exploring. And for me, that was enlightening. It was eye-opening, but I still was very naive. And I remember one day on a bus, a gentleman sitting next to me, turning to me and saying, "Has anyone ever told you you look like Lauren Bacall?" I had no idea who Lauren Bacall was. And that evening, I spoke to my mother and I said, "Who is Lauren Bacall?" This is truly only a few months after I left. I said, "Who is Lauren Bacall?" She said, "Oh, she was an amazing actress, blah, 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 blah." And it was like, it was completely passed me by. I had no idea whether I was pretty, I was ugly. I had no idea whether I was bright or stupid.
Right.
And so 20 years later, I was at a dinner party in East Hampton, and it was, I believe it was a fundraiser for the fire department. And I was sitting at we were sitting at long picnic tables, and there was a man sitting right across from me, and he turned to me across the table and said, "Has anyone ever told you you look like Lauren Bacall?" And I was like, oh my gosh, the very, very same words. And I was brought back to that moment in the bus. And at least this time I knew to be flattered.
That's wonderful. We're getting a lot of audience questions, so let's open the floor. We have a question from Donglan, which is, what is one event that happened while you were there that you'll never forget? If you had to narrow it down to just one, there are many poignant passages.
Well, there are thousands, but it may not be so much an incident, but I will tell you one of the most amazing experiences I had, and this is a very positive one, and if the questioner is looking for a horrific one, they can get those. But when I was 12 years old, we were living now in Harvard, Massachusetts, and we were totally self-sufficient. We had cows, we had chickens, we had horses, we had animals of all sorts and pets. And when I was 12 years old, we embarked on building a 20 by 40 by 10 stone chicken coop. And we had to dismantle these giant stone walls that had been built over the several hundred years when settlers came, and the New England soil is so rocky. And we put this thing together, little sisters and little brothers, under the guidance of the big sisters. And we built this edifice. And I remember thinking of myself as a frontierswoman. And
you
felt
were.
so emboldened and felt so strong. And that here we were, and the end of the summer, we had finished the whole chicken coop, and we had been raising these 300 chickens that we let into the chicken coop. And that evening, Sister Catherine took the oldest ones of us out, down to a little deli, not even a roadside stand.
Oh, yeah.
Called Day's Deli. And she let us out of the car and said, "You can order anything you want." We had never in our lives been in a restaurant. And there we are in our outfits with our skirts down to our ankles and jackets and all buttoned up, even though it's the middle of the hot summer. And those kids, it's 1965, and they're in hot pants and tank tops. And she doesn't even seem to mind for some reason. And we're sitting there and nobody knows what to say. And I walked up and I said, "I would like a double hot fudge sundae, banana split with whipped cream and cherries on top." And that was kind of the thank you for the end of the summer, but it stuck in my memory as being one of those introduction to the outside world.
Yes. Well, it looks like even then in that little deli, you always knew what you wanted, right? Always bold, sticking to your guns. Okay, so another question is, do you feel that there are any positives? Oh, this is from Richard, sorry. Do you feel that there are any positives that can be taken away from growing up in this type of environment? And it seems that you do, so please share.
Absolutely. As I said to my parents when I was 55, I look back on my childhood with great happiness. And those were the very words I used, and it is true. Of course, I wanted a different life, and I wanted to have my own family, and I imagined what family life would be like. But that being said, when you are in an environment, even if it's suboptimal, and suboptimal may be a kind word for the way I grew up, you make more than the best of it. We had fun, we had games, we swam, we horseback rode. Yes, there was lots and lots of silence, and yes, it seemed I broke a rule every single time I turned around. But in addition to that, I will say, one, the food was phenomenal. And we learned to be very self-sufficient. We learned to can. We canned all our own apples and pears, and at the end of the summer, so when all the fruit was coming in, and that was what we had all through the winter. To this day, every fall, I get 3 or 4 bushels of apples and pears, and I can them. And I can them in silence. Silence was our mode. Silence to me feels so calming. And, you know, now I'll invite friends, but if it gets too noisy, I go, shh, 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 shh. You know, this is a meditative process. So I can tell so many stories about how wonderful it was. I think the success I've had in my own life, in my professional life, has in large measure come from so much of the good that I got out of my childhood.
Oh, that's so beautiful. Yeah. That's so beautiful. Well, self-sufficiency can be, I think in this case, both positive and negative, because you had these wonderful community building experiences, but then at the same time you were, you know, separated from direct contact with your parents when you and your siblings were just 3 years old was the minimum.
Correct. Yes.
And I think it's really phenomenal that you've turned that into something so positive for yourself.
Well, again, I will credit my parents, particularly my father, who just chose to break the rules. And I was so scared because I thought, oh, they're going to kick him out. And then I won't see him at all. But fortunately,
yes,
we were able to maintain our little connections.
Of course. So we have a particularly powerful question from Lexi, which is, how has your upbringing and your feelings towards your upbringing influenced the way that you've raised your own family?
Thank you for asking that question. And I do allude to that in the book. And in the book, you will read a lot about one of my siblings, my sister Kathy. And she suffered tremendously. And her pain from losing her parents, and she was 18 months, 20 months younger than I was so great that she would go for periods of time without eating. And she wouldn't eat her breakfast, and then they would bring her back the breakfast for lunch. And when she didn't eat it, they'd bring it back for dinner. And I used to think she was going to die. And I tell stories in the book, and I actually would sometimes eat her food to prevent her from being spanked when she wouldn't eat her own food. And so basically, I basically took her on almost as my own child.
Yes.
I felt that I was her mother, and I was just torn when she would be punished for what she was doing. So basically, I'm trying to remember how would she like to explain the tough
how your upbringing has influenced the way
my
that you
own
raised your
children.
own family. Yes.
So watching food be used as a weapon against her. When I was having my own children, and I had twins, I remember saying to myself, there were 3 things that came out of my upbringing. The first was, and again, physical punishment was horrific.
Yes.
I will not deny that. And I thought to myself, there's no need ever to hit a child.
No.
And I lived by that rule completely. If you get frustrated with a child enough, my attitude is hit your own hand. I mean, you're just really frustrated. Quiet down yourself by going, and go, yes, all right. So we never, ever, my husband and I, we just never hit our children. The second one was because of my sister Kathy.
Yes.
The food would never, ever be an issue.
Of course.
So I think I may have taken that a little bit far because with 2 children, one would eat anything. Our daughter would eat almost anything as a young child.
Yes.
And our son would eat white toast with crust cut off, hot dogs, ketchup, and he did not have a very large palate. But he loved raw broccoli.
Oh, that's wonderful.
I thought, this is a good combo.
Surprising for a kid.
So I decided each child would have whatever each child wanted for every meal.
Oh, that's wonderful.
And I said, well, if I'm doing that for the 2 children, might as well do that for my husband and me.
Right?
So there were evenings when we had 4 different meals on the table for all 4 of us. And I remember one day when my children, I think, were in the 7th grade or so, And I said, we were all waiting for them to come out, and I was talking to one of the moms, and I said, do you think I can just run in? I just want to ask my children what they want for dinner.
Right.
And she said, you ask your children what they want for dinner? And I suddenly realized, oops, I just outed myself.
I think that's wonderful.
And so once we got into our teenage years, and we were very fortunate, we took our children to India and to China and to Egypt. By the time they were in their teenage years, these children were eating anything. So Jim, who was such a picky eater as a child, he has the most varied taste buds. So that was a second thing that was very important in my childhood that I chose to do the opposite of. And the third was, the answer for everything when you asked a question at the center almost always seemed to be no. And granted, when you're raising children, you have to be able to say no.
Of course.
But I thought, I'm going to try to say no in a way that gives them hope that maybe there's a yes sometime down the road. So those were the three primary takeaways that I had.
Absolutely. Well, I think it's wonderful that you have that viewpoint on food. I have to say that some of the most chilling passages in the memoir were the images of Sister Catherine bringing out the same food over and over again to your sister. That was truly hard to read because of how striking it was. So I think it's really wonderful that you've been able to kind of take what you learned from that experience, bring it to your own family.
Thank you. It was her way of rebelling. She was very bold and very brave, frankly.
So another audience question. We have a comment from Amanda who says, loving this, bravo. So some positivity. And then we have a question from Sage. So we've talked about kind of how you're looking back on things as an adult. But as a child, did you perceive that there was something unusual going on, or were there any particular moments where something stood out to you and you thought, I think something's not normal here?
I thought that all the time.
Yes.
I would imagine what it was like to be in someone else's house. But I do remember one particular incident. So my parents, my father and my mother, each wore a wedding ring. And I remembered when we moved out to Still River one Sunday, and my father had a very special ring. It was very, very slender, just like this, and I chose my ring very much for the same reason. And it had this tiny little beading around the edge of it. And so as a child, I would always just play with the beading. And one day I was holding his hand, and his ring wasn't on his finger. And I said, where's your ring? And he told me that he had put it safely inside his scapula, which was a very Catholic thing. And then I looked and saw that my mother didn't have her ring. So my parents and all of the parents, there were 12 sets of parents, were required to take their rings off. However, Sister Catherine, who was a married woman, who had a husband and 2 children, and who went home to see them 3 nights a week, she kept her ring on her finger. And I remember thinking, why can she keep her ring on? And my father can't keep his ring on. And when I first left the center, when I was kicked out, a couple of years later, my father would come down and visit me and my mother. My mother had kind of moved out. And one evening at dinner, my father said to me, if I should die while I am living up there, not knowing that he was going to come out. He really, I don't think at that time was planning to leave. He said, I want you to take my ring out of this little scapular I wear, and I want you to put it on my finger so that the world knows that I was a married man.
Incredibly powerful.
So that was very important. And I said, Dad, I called him Daddy by then because I was out.
Of
course. And I said, Daddy, you're only 52. You have a long time to live. Unfortunately, he lived to be 89. The day he left the center, he put that ring back on his finger. It never left his finger. And when he died, I remember thinking, you're burying your parent, and I'm thinking, I would just so love that ring because I remembered it as a child, and I thought, it's just going to be go. And then I remembered his words, and I thought, I know the circumstances are different, but he said, bury me with my ring on, and so I said, that's the way it should be.
That's so incredibly powerful. And I think it's also so powerful and striking in almost the opposite way to reflect on the level of hypocrisy that Sister Catherine showed in being able to visit her family so freely, whereas the relationships within the community were very heavily monitored.
true, but I will tell you there was one blessing, because 3 nights a week when she went home, not only I, but I could tell even the angels, those were the women that were put in charge of raising us, even the tension kind of left. It was like everybody could just breathe a little bit until she came in the next day, and then the tension started up again. So.
Yeah. So here's a question from Erica, and we're gonna use the cult word here because it's part of the question. So, what do you think drives people to be in cults, or to be, I suppose, in communities where things are different than they are on the outside world? Is it fear? Is it manipulation? What's kind of your perspective on the reason why people stay?
I am probably not the best person to answer that, because while I might have stayed, I would have been kicked out eventually.
Fair, yeah.
And having subsequently left, I find myself being very much a champion for people standing up for their own rights and for pushing back when there is some kind of brutality or some kind of unfairness. Fairness has always mattered to me. But I think in looking at my own parents, and I certainly spoke to them at length, and we never argued and we never fought, and I never said, how could you have done this to us? I understand that when people believe extremely strongly in something, they are willing to make sacrifices. But my father said something that I think maybe be very helpful here. After he left, and he said this on more than one occasion, he said, each change seemed small in itself. And he compared it to a snowball. And he said it was just like you turn the snowball and it gets a little bigger, and you turn and you turn. And he said, after a certain point, the snowball got too big to move. And I thought that was his way of saying he was trapped.
Oh.
But it was so gradual. And so, and I don't even know whether Sister Catherine herself had a grand scheme, or whether each time she took a step and that snowball rolled and nobody said, no way, Jose.
Of course.
They said, okay, she told us to do it. She went, okay, I can do it again and again. And whether that was deliberate or subliminal on her part, I don't know. But for my father to be able to stand outside and look back in on his life and say, I can see what happened to me, was enlightening. Personally, I don't think I'm the personality that could ever have even gotten that far.
Yes, well, you're an extremely independent and driven person, in part which has driven your really fascinating career success. What an interesting life trajectory you've had.
Well, yes, I bet it also was one that I really truly started at the very, very, very bottom of the scale.
Absolutely.
And I hope for people that's very encouraging. And I do a lot of mentoring today.
Yes.
It's really kind of my spiritual joy is to help people. I work with middle school girls in Harlem, and those are my happiest days.
Of course.
The hour and a half I spend with them, helping them, sharing my story with them. And so for me, I can only say, help people to try to be themselves.
Yes.
Think as big and as huge as you can. You won't think big enough when you start. But each time you get closer and closer to what you thought was big, you go, oh, big can be even bigger and bigger and bigger, till you finally find yourself fulfilled and wanting to share that with others.
And that's been so true in your life. So I think what we really all want to know is there going to be more to your story? Do we get to find out what happens next? How you got from, just starting out, your roommates not paying the rent, all of this, to getting where you are today? Is there more?
Well, people have asked me if I would write the story of my career, which did really start at the very, very, very bottom. And I think there's a wonderful moral, and there's a wonderful story, and some of it is very funny, insane. I mean, it was a Wall Street career, so you can imagine, not that some of the stories that I've seen and heard ever really happened to me. Some of them were crazier that happened to me, and I was a machinery analyst, so there I was riding around on big trucks and going on oil rigs and all of that. But I think there is a story that can be told about how one can actually achieve one's dreams. And I think I will look forward to sharing that one.
Okay, so that means we're going to see something else on the shelf
Yes,
from you?
Maybe.
All right. Well,
And it will not take 10 years. That
Okay,
will be
good,
ridiculous.
good.
Be 80 years old, but I'm giving myself a couple of years to do that.
Good. I certainly don't want to wait 10, so you better hurry up.
Thank you.
So before we conclude, where can we find you on social media, your website? Tell us where to follow you.
Thank you. My website is very simple, patriciachadwick.com, and I've got so much information. I've got videos, I've got blogs that I write, because I do now write for a couple of newspapers. I'm on Instagram, Patricia_Chadwick. I'm on Facebook. I've been friending a lot of people. LinkedIn, and my wonderful social media publicist, Jen Hansen DePaula, who's fantastic. She's just populating things all the time for me. And I respond. Actually, when people say they want to friend me, I mean, as long as it looks as though they're truly interested, I love it. I'm happy to share. So patriciachadwick.com is the place where you can find almost everything. Is that helpful?
Perfect. Very helpful. Thank you so much for being here with us today and giving all your insightful answers. Thank you so much for watching, and please remember to pick up a copy of Little Sister, a Memoir.
Thank you so much.